Thank you, Sierra. Shortly after the flood, can I pull this up just a little bit? Shortly after the flood, we see a new word used in the Bible. I talked a little bit about this in the spring. The first maybe 3 minutes of this sermon is going to be a little bit of a refresher. We see a new word used in the Bible about a system that would arise and change the course of the entire world in the way that it influences and impacts all of humanity. And it's something that still today is impacting each and every one of us. Turn with me to Genesis 10. Not only does it impact us still to this day, it will impact all of mankind all the way until the return of Jesus Christ. Genesis 10. Genesis 10 is one of those chapters that is called like a genealogy chapter. It lists all the begots that sometimes people get bored in reading. And this one specifically is the genealogy of the family of Noah. But then in verse 8, it does something. It pauses from that genealogy and it makes a statement. And it's something that's easy to read over because on the surface, the statement can be missed of the depth that's there. So in Genesis 10 and verse 8, we're introduced to the grandson, or the great-grandson, rather, of Noah. And his name is Nimrod. He came through the family line of Ham and then Cush. And it's a family line that we'll see this week in the Bible reading program clearly turns away from God. Very quickly after the flood, this line of Ham, of Noah's son, turns away from God. In Genesis 10:8, it says, Cush begot Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one, someone who's powerful on the earth. Verse 9, and he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And again, on the surface, seems to be a rather strange thing to draw out in the middle of this genealogy that Nimrod was this mighty hunter before the Lord. That's before we dig deeper. And when we dig a little deeper, we see that within the Hebrew, there's this idea of Nimrod being before God, almost standing face to face with God in that way. And the language here, as we look at other commentaries, and we even see how other translations choose to translate this. For example, the International Standard Version says it this way: he became a fearless hunter in defiance of the Lord. That is why it said, like Nimrod, a fearless hunter in defiance of the Lord. And when we actually look at the meaning of Nimrod's own name, we understand it to mean rebellious. So Nimrod means, rebellious or rebellious one. And then in verse 10, we see that there's this new word that's introduced into the Bible, which is the word kingdom. It's the first time this word shows up. And it's important that we stop and we recognize the significance of this. It's in fact that it's here that this is a launching point for a narrative that's going to be woven through the whole rest of the Bible, taking us all the way to Revelation and the return of Jesus Christ. And in verse 10, it says, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. And it lists some other cities here, but this one is one that I want to focus in on. It names, again, other cities and lands that begin to be a part of this kingdom. In verse 11, it says, from that land, he went to Syria and he built Nineveh. And over time, we could look at how out of Nineveh, will eventually grow the Assyrian Empire and from Babylon or Babel, the Babylonian Empire. But again, I want you to focus for a moment just on this concept of a kingdom being established for the first time. Now, we're not given details of how Nimrod convinced people to be a part of a kingdom or to come together under his authority. We're not told if it's by his charismatic personality, whether it's by somehow crafting of cunning arguments, by wealth or by force. But again, what we see is the start of an empire that is an affront to God. It is defiant, it is rebellious against God and God's way. You'll remember that in chapter 11 that these people under this direction begin to build a tower that also stands in this kind of same way. Out of this empire, they decide to build something. If you'll turn over a chapter to Genesis 11:4, you'll see it says, and they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." Now, again, on the surface, we don't immediately read rebellion into this act. But again, keep in mind, that's what Nimrod and Nimrod's system is all about. So it shouldn't surprise us when we dig into history and we read what Josephus, a Jewish historian, said about this Tower of Babel. And I'm going to quote to you several parts that Josephus records about the Tower of Babel. He says, God commanded them to send colonies abroad for the thorough peopling of the earth. So to spread out people from the earth, that they might not raise seditions among themselves, but might cultivate a great part of the earth and enjoy its fruits after a plentiful manner. But they were ill instructed, and they did not obey God. For when they flourished with numerous youth, God admonished them again to send out colonies, but they, imagining the prosperity they enjoyed was not derived from the favor of God, but supposing that their own power was the proper cause of the plentiful conditions they were in, did not obey him. And dropping down, it says, now it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt for God. A bold man and of great strength of hand, he persuaded them not to ascribe it to God as if it was through his means that they were happy, but to believe that, that it was not through God's means that they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured their happiness. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence upon his power. He also said he would be revenged on God if he showed to have a mind to drown the world again, for that he would build a tower too high for the waters to be able to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers. A couple more sections here. Now the multitude were very ready to follow the determination of Nimrod and esteem it a piece of cowardice to submit to God. And they built a tower, neither sparing any pains nor being in any degree negligent about the work. And by reason of the multitude of hands employed in it, grew very high sooner than anyone could have expected. But the thickness of it was so great, and it was so strongly built, that thereby its great height seemed upon the view to be less than it really was. Some say that this was in the shape of a ziggurat, like a pyramid. I always kind of had this idea of this circular tower, but it makes sense back at that time they were building kind of these, and it makes sense that those type of designs don't look as tall as they really are because of the width and how big they are, but that's kind of what's being drawn out here. And finally, when God saw that they acted so madly, he did not resolve to destroy them utterly, since they were not growing wiser by the destruction of former sinners, but he caused a tumult among them by producing in them diverse languages, that they should not be able to understand one another. The place wherein they built the tower is now called Babylon, because of the confusion of the language which they readily understood before, for the Hebrews means by the word Babel, confusion. So we'll stop quoting there. Now, this is a historical account. It's not God-breathed, but I do believe it makes clear what Nimrod, what we can learn from the Bible, what this tower, what this empire was all about, and kind of just bring some color to that. Now, this kingdom, this empire, grows into Babylon. And over the next approximately 2,000 years, this kingdom will rise and fall in its might and its strength and its world power. But in addition to this Babylon, like a little bit of yeast, that kind of this idea of Babylon spreads. And we'll see, there's other kingdoms. There's that this idea of man building empires, ruled by man's laws, by man's way of doing things, giving credit to themselves for their greatness, all this in rejection of God's way. Many other kingdoms and empires would rise and fall, and they would have different aspects, different capitals, different details. But the truth is, they're all really the same thing. They're all really the same form of man's kingdoms and empires that are just a different way of representing this Babylonian idea that springs up here early after the flood. And even God's own nation wasn't immune to this idea taking hold. Much later in the Old Testament, we find that even the nation of Judah has rebelled against God. They too keep going their own way. And after rejecting God time and time again, God uses this Babylonian empire to conquer them and to take them into captivity. And that was the dominant world power at that time. Empires then, like empires now, are all about the same thing, right? Making money and having power. And so it's within these empire systems that they often wouldn't want to come in and just conquer you right away. I guess that's what I had in mind. I was like, oh, their idea is just to come in and conquer and conquer and conquer. But actually, what was much better for an empire, because conquering other kingdoms and other lands, you have to expend capital to do that. You have to expend money and resources and even human capital of soldiers to do that. And so what they'd rather do is apply some pressure on you and have you pay us money and tribute and fall under our way of doing things and our rules and subject yourself to us. And if you do that, you can keep your culture, you can keep your own kind of way of doing things, but you're going to make sure you recognize us and pay us the money. And in that, we can keep building towers and we can keep building idols to ourselves and we can keep expanding the empire and building big things. But long as you keep paying us that money. So, and we see that in the history of Judah. Babylon doesn't just come in and conquer them on day one. They subject them under their authority and their power and say, you send us a tribute, as long as you keep paying us and working within the system that we've designed here, everything's going to be all right. But you rebel against us, and now we have a problem. And within that, that's what we see Judah do. Occasionally, they say, no, we don't want to pay this tribute anymore. And so Babylon would come in, and they'd kind of thump them in the mouth, and they'd say, fall back in line. And if you fall back in line, we'll go back home with our soldiers and our troops, and you keep paying us the money, and the system works, and on it goes. And then, so that's the system that we see set up here and goes on. And again, you can kind of keep your culture and your own gods and your own way of doing things as long as you really recognize us as the supreme authority here. And at this time we already have the kings being worshipped, this idea of government coming together with religion. The Babylonian king was already set up as the kind of chief god that you worshipped at that time. When Rome comes later, there was emperor worship as a deity, and that we already see within the system that the joining of religion and government already comes together. And we'll see that at the end times again, when the final beast power, this final form of Babylon comes to be, that those two situations exist again, where we have religion, worship this beast power, this false prophet, and then also combined with government. And then after that, we see that Judah finally goes too far. They push the Babylonian Empire too far. And within that, Babylon finally says, enough. And they come in and they say, okay, you didn't want to participate in the program. So now we're gonna come in and we're gonna pull you out. We're gonna bring you into our own land, and we're gonna take away your culture. We're gonna indoctrinate you into all of our systems. We're gonna tear down your temple. We're gonna take all your religious idols or religious artifacts and different items, and we're going to take that away, and they're ours now. We're going to tear down your temple, and we're going to tear down your government, and all these things. And so they come in, and that's what Babylon finally does. They come in and they take God's people away, and they tear down the temple and they destroy it, and they then begin a process of trying to integrate Judah into their system, their culture, strip them of their identity. And so through several waves, King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of this Babylonian empire at that time of Judah, hauls off most of the people of Judah to his kingdom. And I want to pause there for a moment, because I want you to let that sink in for a moment. You're God's true people. And let's pretend you're not one of the people who have, abandoned God over time and stopped obeying the Sabbath and stopped doing those things. But through all the things that your nation has done, you've been trying to work and keep the Sabbath, keep the holy days, to follow the commandments, to obey God, and you've been trying your best to do it. But even in the midst of that, now this evil empire that has nothing to do with God comes in and they destroy everything that you hold dear in your life. They destroy your temple. They take your king and in front of him kill every one of his sons. Then they put out his eyes and then bind him in bronze fetters and hauls him away. And you're witnessing all this. And then everybody you care about is taken away and absorbed into this system. And that's what we find happens to these individuals in Judah. And we're going to look at a few of those examples here. But imagine this time of turmoil in your life, the emotional effect that would have on you, the mental, the physical, just this complete system or situation that you're in that is would affect you so deeply. We sang, and I asked Mr. McKeelan today to lead hymn 80, because I think we can sing that song by the waters of Babylon and completely miss what is going on when they wrote those words and what that situation was. I know for me personally, some of these hymns that come out of the Old English or, the King James Version, sometimes I don't always have them hit me to know what the depth of those words truly were. Turn with me, because I'd like to look at the Psalm in Psalm 137, where we get those words for by the water of Babylon. And I would like that to maybe spring to life in a new way for us today for just a second. Psalm 137. You'll find these words very familiar based on that song again. It says, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion, that being, Jerusalem. Verse 2, we hung our harps upon the willows in the midst of it. Now, that statement might not mean a lot to us, but those harps were involved in the temple worship. And if there's no temple and your temple was just destroyed, what use are these harps anymore? And so, we've hung them up on these willows along the riverway here in Babylon, where it was lined with all these willow trees. In verse 3, for there those who carried us away captive asked us of us a song, and those who plundered us requested mirth. So some of the commentators bring out that these soldiers are kind of tormenting them. Sing us a song about Jerusalem that we've destroyed, all you captives. And, and they're down. Sing us one of those songs of Zion. It seems like a very insulting and a very unreasonable request that the captors have. Sing us one of your worship songs. Verse 4, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Sometimes God's true faithful people have no choice where they dwell, and this is one of those examples. These individuals had no choice where they were, and the song is a song of sorrow for what has happened to the land and the temple and all these things that they love so much. And I think that we should remember that when we sing this song, that these individuals were hauled away from their home. And so I'd like you to turn with me to Daniel 1 now, because it hit me recently for the first time that in Daniel, we get something recorded that is unusual in the Bible, where God's faithful individuals are physically living in Babylon. No longer in the promised land, no longer in the country surrounded by all these people that want to obey God, or at least, that's the idea there. But now they're in a strange land, trying to operate as God's people. And it hit me, that's exactly what we're doing. We are strangers living in this land of Babylon, this empire that started a long time ago, still exists today, and we'll see in Revelation in a little bit. still exists in the future that God talks about. And so I was like, well, what did they do? How did they navigate this difficult time of living in Babylon as God's true faithful people? And what lessons can we as God's people today, trying to emulate these examples of these faithful true servants, what could we do? So that's kind of where we're going now, is again understanding that this isn't our homeland. This isn't our kingdom now. We're living in a Babylon, but this isn't our homeland. We look for the kingdom still to come. But yet, right now, day in and day out, here we are living in Babylon. So we're going to do kind of a review of Daniel. I'm going to try to do that as quickly as I kind of can, and we'll point out some points along the way. But we're going to do kind of a flyover of Daniel and land at a few spots along the way. So starting in Daniel 1:1, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Dropping down to verse 3. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. Okay, we're going to take your best of your best, all your brightest, all your wisest, all the people with talent, and we're going to indoctrinate them into our way of doing things, our culture, our books, and we're going to strip out all that Judah stuff from them, and we're going to try to make them be a part of our empire. So in verse 5, and the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years, notice 3 years of training for them, that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. So this isn't okay, in a month we're going to indoctrinate you into our way of doing things. We're going to take 3 years here, and we're going to make you Babylonians. And verse 6, now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They even are going to strip away their names and give them pagan names. We'll look at that here in just a second. But they were trying to strip them of their former identity, try to get them to leave all that behind them and to see themselves as Babylonian and the empire. Forget your religion, forget your country, forget your way of doing things, and adopt ours. In verse 7, to them the chief of the eunuchs gave names to Daniel, Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, and Mishael, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Now, what I want you to understand here is that they went from having names that was about the one true God, names meaning God is my judge, who Jehovah has favored, who is comparable to God, whom Jehovah helps. That's what names they had. And they're given then names of Bel's prince after the chief pagan god there. Illuminated by the sun god was another name. They changed out El for God to Shak after the Babylonian goddess. And then the last one, servant of the shining fire. That's what these names meant. They stripped away everything about God and they inserted all this pagan identity into even what they would be called. And again, imagine how difficult of a place this would be. Our young people live in a world that's trying to do the exact same thing. Strip out everything good about God, all of the culture that we've established in them since they were young, and replace it with all these other ideas about their empire, their system. This is what we want you to adopt and become. And they're very good at it. Satan has crafted a system here that slowly whittles away bit by bit at what God's truth is, and our young people are facing a challenge right now that is unlike any other in human history. And I know it's always been bad, it always will be bad, but it just gets worse and worse day after day for our young people of how this identity is trying to be stripped out of them and replaced. And it's similar to what we're seeing here. Now, when I went through the book of Daniel, I did it this way. I said, okay, I'm going to go through and I'm just going to start jotting notes to myself. What is the lesson that jumps out to me from a set of passages? And I started doing that through chapter after chapter. And at the end, I took all those and I kind of gathered them together and said, okay, I had the same one here, here, and here. I'm going to make that into one. And at the end of it, I came up with 7 points for you today. It wasn't designed that way. It's just how it came out. And I'm going to give them all 7 to you right here up front. And I'm going to ask you to pay attention to where these come back up. Now, when I gave this last time, my wife said I went too fast to them. So I'm going to try to slow down. She also says I didn't say them twice, which I did. I'm just kidding. So here it is. 7 lessons for living in Babylon. 7 lessons for living in Babylon. That was twice. And then here's point 1. Refuse to compromise. Refuse to compromise. Number 2, power of prayer. Power of prayer. 3, willingness to suffer or die for God's way. Willingness to suffer or die for God's way. 4, giving thanks. Giving thanks. 5, give God the glory. 5, give God the glory. 6, let the light shine. Let the light shine. And lastly, blessings for obedience. Blessings for obedience. Now, was that at a pace everybody got them down? Still not. All right. Refuse to compromise. 2, power of prayer. 3 is the long one. Willingness to suffer or die for God's way. 4, giving thanks. 5, give God the glory. 6, let the light shine. And 7, blessings for obedience. Okay. If you didn't get it by then, borrow from a neighbor. All right. So now we're going to start going through this, and we're going to look at some of these examples of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah that they set for us. And again, I'll try to just kind of hint at some of these points, but notice these themes that run through, because these are the themes that we need for our life as well. Daniel 1 and verse 8, but Daniel, notice, purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now, we're not told what here was against God's law, but there was obviously something here, whether it was offered to pagan idols or somehow unclean. There's something here that Daniel knew, I shouldn't touch this. And notice it says he refused to compromise. He purposed in his heart he was not going to do these things. And we will see throughout the book of Daniel that they were willing to even say, even if that means you kill me, I'm willing to have that be the result, but I'm not compromising, period. Verse 9, now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. So notice right here, who's behind this blessing and favor? It says God brought Daniel into this situation. Sometimes I think in life we can be prone to pat ourselves on the back at times when we do well and people like us and things are going well. But I think we should all pause and go, who gives me favor with man? Who gives me knowledge and the talents that I have that I can be successful? It's God who pours out these blessings. So Daniel says, okay, test us 10 days and see what the results of that testing should be. And you deal as you see fit with your servants. Drop down to verse 15. And at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate of the portion of the king's delicacies. Again, God pours out blessings for their obedience. Verse 17. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skills in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Again, God pouring out gifts for their faithfulness. So again, remember, we're contrasting here this Babylonian way of doing things that Nimrod established long ago. In Nimrod's way, it was, I did all this. I'm the one who is so great. I'm the reason this kingdom is flourishing. And, it's my talents, my abilities, my good looks, my intellect, my strength, you name it. And God has poured out on his church incredible talents. We see them on display all the time. And sometimes it's in public ways like music and and gifts that God's given people in various ways of service, in knowledge. And then there's talents that, we use kind of behind the scenes for baking food for the church to enjoy after Sabbath, and skills that God gives individuals. And the way that we should be different than this Babylonian system is to say, God, thank you for these talents, and thank you for giving me things I can use to serve your brethren and people, and not pat ourselves on our back and say, look how great I am. Moving on, verse 18. Now at the end of days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in his realm. Now, this isn't some small statement. Remember the Babylonian system, right? They come in and they pull out the best of the best. They're trying to build this fantastic empire. They don't take the worst from the society. They steal the best. You're brightest, you're talented, you're best looking, and all these things. So for these individuals to stand out 10 times better than the best of the best, God is doing something here miraculous. It's not just that Daniel and these guys are really smart individuals. God did something really special here, and I think it's important to understand that. Now, moving into chapter 2, we will remember that King Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and he asks something impossible of all of his wise men and astrologers and people like that of the land. And he says, not only do I want you to tell me the interpretation of this dream, I want you to tell me what I dreamt. And they can't do it. No, it's impossible. And none of them can do it. They can't even make it up, right? I mean, at least if I knew the dream, I could make up an interpretation. But if I don't even know what you thought of, there's no way I could get that right. And so notice in verse 16 of Daniel 2, and the king gives a command. All these wise people, including Daniel and his friends, all of them have to be killed because they can't do this. So Daniel finds out about this, and in verse 16, so Daniel went in and he asked the king to give him some time that he might tell the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his house, and he made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. And it said that they might seek mercies from God. Now, what are they doing? They didn't just go home and hope that God would do this. They hit their knees in prayer. That's the obvious implication here. They beseeched God and asked God to bless them in this way. And so that's one of the points that we're again saying is when we're in these difficult situations, hit your knee in prayer, and so that they might seek mercies from God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So again, they had a problem. They knew what to do with it. They took it to God. Verse 19, then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. This is something that I think sometimes we forget to do in our daily lives. At least I know I forget to do it sometimes. I go to God and I say, God, would you please fix this problem? And then God fixes that problem. And I forget to go back and say, God, thank you for fixing that problem. The thankfulness and the response to that, sometimes I fail to do. And I think that can be sometimes common to all of us. But notice Daniel didn't do that. Daniel, the secret's revealed to him. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven in verse 19 and verse 20. Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. Daniel not only remembers to be thankful, but he pours out praise to God for answering his prayer. Verse 23, he says, I thank you and I praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might. I know where these gifts come from and have now made known to me what I asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's demands. So he's saying thank you. Verse 27, Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, the wise men and astrologers, the magicians and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. Verse 30. But as for me, This secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes who make known the interpretation to the king, that you may know the thoughts of your heart. It would be so human to be right here like, hey, Nebuchadnezzar, hey, Neb, look at me. Aren't I pretty great? I came through. Don't you think I deserve something here? Don't you want to bless me? I'm pretty fantastic. Nobody else could do this. That's not what we see in his example. He turns the attention fully back to God, praises God, gives God the glory, says, I'm nothing in this equation. Daniel then reveals this vision of the dream. You'll remember there's a statue in the dream. There's a head of gold, a chest and arms of iron or of silver. You got the legs of bronze, and then the final part of the statue is this mixture of iron and clay. And we understand from that and from later the interpretation of this that we're talking about 4 empires. Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian system, it's that head of gold. There's nothing greater. And then after that, we're going to have this Medo-Persian empire that's going to come. And after that, the Greek empire. And after that, the Roman empire. But they're all the same thing. They're all Babylon. They're all just different forms of this Babel system that was set up by Nimrod all long ago. Just man's way of trying to rule over others, gain power and money, and all that's entailed. Drop down to verse 47. And the king answered Daniel and said, truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and the revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. So the result is what? That God is glorified. A bit of the light shines before King Nebuchadnezzar. He now is glorifying God with his own lips. Notice the blessings that then come in verse 48. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts. And he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. Also, Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. So gifts are poured out for Daniel, even gifts spread to the other friends of his. And then we get into chapter 3. And then in chapter 3, we find that Nebuchadnezzar has again set up now, this time, a big statue for worshiping himself. And he wants everybody to fall down and worship, and he lays out this system. And again, as I mentioned before, that's what this system's always been about. Even from the very beginning, it's always been about worshiping whoever's in control, the king, the emperor, whatever. And we're going to see this play out all the way down to the end times in Revelation, that we have this individual at the head who wants to be worshiped as if he's God. And so Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm going to play music, and you're going to fall down and you're going to worship this image, this idol that I've set up. And if you don't, it's straight into the fiery furnace for all of you. And so it says in Daniel 3, verse 8, therefore at a certain time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. And it's worth stopping and understanding that when we do it right, when we go all in, when we say, I'm not willing to compromise, I'm going to follow you, God, it doesn't mean everything's going to be easy. It probably actually means the opposite. And people are going to find a way to accuse us, and sometimes falsely. And in this case, they were saying accurately, these guys aren't bowing down. They're not doing what you said, and they're going to come under persecution for being obedient to God's way. And it's a question to all of us. Will we remain faithful no matter what, even in the face of being persecuted for the beliefs that we hold so dear? Because that's the only real option that we have is, yes, we'll see it through no matter what somebody can do to us in this lifetime. There's lots of excuses. If you've been in the church, you've probably heard many times people give excuses for why they need to compromise on God's way. But that's not the example we see Daniel and his friends set here in Babylon. In verse 12 of Daniel 3, there are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. All that's true. So like Daniel, these individuals are refusing to compromise, even if it means death. Verse 16. And this is one of my favorite lines of the entire Bible. I think it's one of the great responses of the Bible. Daniel 3:16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, love that. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. No compromise. I mean, that's beautiful. I'm willing to go as far as it takes. I think God's going to save us. He can. He has all power. Everything's within his control. But if not, you can take our lives. It's an amazing example, one I hope we always hold close to our heart. And of course, we know they don't die. God blesses them in this moment and saves them. Not even the smell of smoke gets into their clothes. I mean, that's the detail that God goes to show. I have complete power and control here. There's nothing that can even penetrate here when God puts his protection. In verse 28 of Daniel 3, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any God except their own God. The light of the truth shines in this moment again. And again, God is the one who is glorified. Verse 30, then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. More blessings are poured out. They just keep coming. And in chapter 5, a new king is now in charge, Belshazzar. And he's being completely disrespectful to the objects, the vessels and things that came out of the temple in Judah. He's treating them very disrespectfully. And we get that famous account of the hand that's writing on the wall with no body, just the hand up there. That freaks out Belshazzar. And again, Daniel's remembered and he's called for. In Daniel 5 and verse 17, it says, Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let your gifts be for yourself, and you give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to his interpretation. Notice Daniel's motivation was never in it for the gifts and the rewards. He was obeying God. He says, give them to someone else. Verse 23, and you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk the wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. Again, the truth of God is set before this foolish king. Verse 29, then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Daniel doesn't want the gifts, but the gifts just keep coming. Verse 30, and that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Daniel lived long enough to outlive multiple rulers here. He even sees some of these prophecies that he was used by God to foretell, to even see him coming into fruition. It's pretty remarkable when you really think about his life. We'll look at one more chapter, Daniel 6. This is the famous chapter that we tell in all the Bible stories, and the lion's den, Daniel and the lion's den. And we love this story because it shows the unwavering faithfulness again of Daniel and how he's blessed again by God. And again, I want you to notice persecution still happens even when you do things right. Daniel 6 verse 4. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could not find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. They're trying to figure out a way to get him. They can't, not based on what he's actually doing. So then in verse 7, all the governors of the kingdom and administrators and satraps and counselors and advisors, they consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. So they can't find anything to get them on, so they come up with a law that they know Daniel won't compromise. He's going to still do these things, and we can get them that way. And so in verse 10, they get this new law signed. Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home and in his upper room with his windows open toward Jerusalem. He knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Notice again, not even a little bit of compromise. In our human wisdom, we could say, all right, I'll at least shut the windows, right? I'll pray once today. That's still praying. I'm still being obedient to God. But Daniel was unwavering. He said, no, I'm not changing anything from how I worship God. I'm going to do it exactly the same way. And if that means I get thrown into the lion's den, I get thrown into the lion's den. But that inability to change even a little bit is just a remarkable example that I hope we all hold true to. So he goes home and he prays 3 times. Verse 13, so they answered and said before the king that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard to you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. So the king gave the command in verse 16. King gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But notice, but the king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. The truth of God has now started to impact this king in such an amazing way that King Darius, he knows that God is likely going to save Daniel out of this situation. Verse 18, now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him, and his sleep went from him. And we, of course, know this story. We know Daniel's fine. God saves him again. Verse 26, and I make a decree that in every dominion, so King Darius is saying this, I make a decree in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. And that is a statement that is fact. There is a kingdom coming that will never be destroyed, will never end. And that is what we just ended up celebrating in the Feast of Tabernacles, the time when that will be established. What a statement of truth here from King Darius. So as we end this sermon, let's go to Revelation. Revelation 16. Verse 17, Revelation 16, verse 17, we move to the end of the story, as they say. We understand that while we all today still live in this Babylonian system, we know that this empire will not last forever. It will fall, and we look forward to that happening. We pray for God's kingdom to come. In verse 16 and Revelation 16, 17, we come to this big moment. It's kind of the climax of it all in Revelation. You'll remember that at first there's a seal, and Jesus Christ begins to open up seal after seal of the 7 seals. So he's opened all 7 seals. Then from within that 7th seal, 7 angels begin to blow trumpets, and a number of events start to happen. And that 7th trumpet is blown, and Jesus Christ returns. And then within that 7th trumpet, 7 last plagues and bowls begin to be poured out on mankind. And we come at this moment in Revelation 16, 17 to the very last trumpet. So the last of the seals, the last of the trumpets, and the last plague bowl. We come to that 7th of the 7, kind of thing. The very last one. Then the 7th angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple of heaven from the throne saying, "It is done." And there were noises and thunderings and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake. Such a mighty and great earthquake has not occurred since men were on the earth. Now that great city, which if you look at, any number of commentaries, they'll tell you that this is Rome. was divided into three parts. So the earthquakes, splits this city apart, and the cities of the nations fell. And great Babylon was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. See, and great Babylon was remembered before God. And every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. And great hail from heaven fell upon men, each hailstone about the weight of a talent. Now, a Jewish talent weighs about 113 pounds. So when we're talking about great hail falling down, we're talking about, regardless of the weight of a talent, a lot of weight. And men blasphemed God because of the plague of hail, since the plague was exceedingly great. Then in chapter 17 of Revelation is one of these inset chapters, and it says in Revelation 17:1, then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked with me, saying, come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Verse 15, then he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are the peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. It's a whole earth made up of all the different languages that sprang out of the rebellion at Babel. Again, people of all languages and tongues and nations. Verse 4 of Revelation 17. I'm backing up to verse 4. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication, of this false worship. Verse 5, and on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. This system that exists now and has existed through time still exists all the way up to the very end. This mystery of Babylon the Great, all the power, all the wealth, all this false religious system, and all the manners of sins. In verse 6, and I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. It's a system that has been the torment of God's true people down through time. Turn with me back to Revelation 18. Revelation 18:1. After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. Verse 3, for all the nations have drunk of the wine of her wrath, of the wrath of her fornication, rather. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. Verse 5, for her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Verse 8, therefore her plagues will come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judges her. The kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, alas, alas, that great city of Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. Verse 20, rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. Finally, this Babylonian system comes to its final and permanent end. And this marks a dramatic shift that we again just kept the Feast of Tabernacles. You probably heard sermons about this drastic shift that will take place at the return of Jesus Christ, his second coming, when finally this system that Nimrod set up and has mankind has perpetuated down through time, certainly with Satan behind it, finally comes to a permanent end. Finally, Jesus Christ's kingdom comes, the kingdom of God, and it stands in a complete contrast to this system that has been here for all time. You don't need to turn there. Just write down Isaiah 9, 6, and 7, and I'll read it. You probably read this at the feast or heard it in a sermon. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government, his empire, will be upon his shoulder. And his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, and of the increase of his government, his empire, and peace, there will be no end. That's what we're looking forward to. Instead of wars, peace will be established and preserved. Instead of false religion, pure religion will finally be established for the first time since the very beginning. No more will you have men propping themselves up to be worshiped as gods. We look forward to a time where prosperity in the world will be the norm, where anxiety is low, where connections with people are actually made and real relationships are built, where there will be great abundance, so much that we have that imagery that's in the Bible about how those that are planting are nipping at the heels with those that are reaping the harvest. I mean, just time of great abundance. There will be fair laws, no more injustice in the world, no more bribes, no more favoritism, no more devices of war. Things that were used to be used for war will be turned into instruments that are used for producing food and helping people. People will have knowledge. Mankind will understand who God is, what his plan is for them, and how to get into the family. Satan will be banished. No one will be sending out wavelengths anymore that are full of half-truths and temptations for mankind. Serving and esteeming others will be the norm. This is the kingdom that's worth giving our life for. Nothing man offers, nothing there's worth giving our life for. This is what's worth giving our lives for. Even today, in everything we do, going all in, giving it all to God, saying there's nothing in this world for me. This is where I'm focusing on. This is what my daily life's going to be from the time I wake up to the time I fall asleep. This is what I want to be about, becoming a part of this system. If we would have more time, we'd turn to Matthew 20, 25 through 28, where Christ talked about he didn't come to be served, but to serve. That's what we're all supposed to be about, right? We're trying to become people who serve other people, who aren't in it for our power and our might and our glory, but we're willing to be about serving others, about love, what all the laws that God gave were based on. You know, Jesus Christ came and he fed the poor. He healed the sick. He lifted up those that were oppressed, and he gave hope. So, brethren, in conclusion, shortly after the flood, we see the first kingdom arise. And it's one of opposition and rebellion against God. It's a group of people building a system where they wanted to rule. They wanted to direct people to live by their own way, one built on oppression and tyranny, on greed and power. And then we have this example of Daniel, of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who served as a powerful example that you can still live in this empire and this system and live in a different way, where you can refuse to compromise, where you can remain steadfast in prayer, willing to suffer and even give your life, willing to follow God and making sure to give God thanks and glory for all of his blessings and his gifts, and allow the truth to shine in whatever way God allows it to get out into this dark world, and where we know that God will bless us for our obedience in one way or another. Let us live a life where the same thing that's recorded of these men could be recorded of us as we too live in Babylon. And may God speed the time where this opposing system of Babylon falls and where a completely different kingdom can finally be set up. One that the world has never seen or been able to experience. One that'll be ushered in by our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And one where we will be right there, spirit beings serving right alongside our great brother in that great kingdom that will never end.